welcome to our session today. Thank you for your time. We're talking about the Unilever implementation of Unity Catalog specific for the European market, which Roberto, who's here to talk with me, heads up. So over the next half an hour or so, we'll be talking about the context in which we started thinking about Unity Catalog, how we went about doing it, what the approach was, what are the challenges that we hit while doing that, and once that is done, and while now it's a mainstream adoption, what the benefits are that we are running out of that as well. So really keen to get stuck in with the content. Thank you again for being here. A quick introduction. So I am Athulya Ramamoorthy. I'm the Senior Solution Architect with Databricks. I am also the Global Technical Lead for the Unilever account. And I work very closely with Roberto. I think we speak almost on a daily basis just to make sure that we're aligned in how we're doing things. And he's got a person to talk to in terms of there are any technical questions. And especially with regards to Unity Catalog, because of the maturity of the Unilever estate, and we'll talk about that in a bit, and the challenges that come with that, and the options that we have, and the opportunities that we had. It's been a really, really close interaction. I'm really, really excited to be doing this talk with Roberto today. I'll hand over to Roberto now.
Yeah, hi everyone. Before I talk about myself, I first want to talk about the people on the screen. They're the ones that do all the work, actually. So every day they show up with dedication, ambition, and an open mind. They push each other to greater heights. And I'm very lucky to work with each and every one of them. So that's them. This is me. My name's Roberto, originally from Venezuela. I work at Unilever 7 years already. That's my mom. And behind me is the lovely city of Rotterdam, where I'm based. So let's go through the agenda. I'm going to walk you through a bit. There's a lot of boxes here, but don't worry, I'll walk you through it. The first, we're going to talk about the context. So what does Unilever's data estate look like? And some of the challenges that come with it. Then we go into Unity Catalog specifics. So if you're new to Unity Catalog, there's a few key concepts that you need to grasp if you're going to move forward. Then, well, lineage is one of the coolest features, so I just dedicate a brief part to that. And then we go into compatibility, which is very interesting. There's compatibility of technology, but also of people. So we talk about both. Then we go into cluster policies and tooling that helps us keep the ship in order. And finally, the best part, brand new world, all the great features we have and why we're never going back. So let's get started with the context. Unilever, we are a consumer goods company. We sell products that are used by more than 3 billion people every day. And we really have a lot of touch points through our supply chain. We purchase raw materials, we manufacture, we distribute, we sell to consumers, and we market, of course. We're also a large marketing firm. That's all the sources on the left side, right? So all of our enterprise data sources. The design for our data lake is that all those enterprise data sources go into the UDL, which is a full fidelity copy of those data sources. And it acts as a source of truth. Further downstream, we have what we call BDL. So we grab those data sources, and depending on the domain, so you could have supply chain, marketing, finance, and you have some use case agnostic transformations on it. So the whole organization can leverage the same assets. And then even further downstream, well, that's me, the market data lake. This is where the organization makes decisions. We make decisions at a BU level, and each BU gets their data set so we can prepare and deliver products to the team, to the business. This is a bit more technical slide of the same thing, but you see our main workhorse is Databricks. We also use Data Factory. Then downstream, we have a dedicated Power BI premium capacity, and communicating those two parts, you have Databricks SQL Serverless, but also Synapse Serverless. We use it depending on the use case. Now, let's talk a bit about Europe, which is the team I'm leading. Europe has a lot of complexity, and that comes from the number of languages we have. We have 24 languages. We have 38 countries. And just to do, this is like a slide from a market performance deck we did. the same exercise in the US would have needed to go through 20 databases. In Europe, we had to go through 316, and they were all in different languages. When we started this journey, Europe was actually also a bit fragmented because prior to a recent reorg we did, the country was looking after the country. And that meant that countries like UK, Benelux, France were ahead of the rest of Europe in terms of data maturity. We've, of course, changed that. We made it one European team. Now we have one source of truth for Europe. Also Australia and New Zealand, don't ask me why. I think they like Eurovision. But yeah, now we process 8 billion records of data, and we, in the process, decommissioned a bunch of shadow IT. And now Athulya can go to the next part.
So one of the things we started talking about when we were thinking about UC is what are the challenges that we're trying to address by implementing Unity Catalog, because we wanted to have some kind of a benchmark based on which we could then go forward with the implementation and then evaluate at the end of it, well, are we able to cover all of these basic requirements that we started off with. So some of the challenges we had, and a little more context to what Roberto added before as well. So Unilever is one of the very early adopters of Databricks. I think we've had it for like 5 years or so at this point. And that was when Databricks became a first-party service with Azure as well. And everything we're talking about here is Azure Databricks. I'm sure there's an equivalent on the other clouds, and we're happy to talk about it. But you'll hear a lot of Azure-specific terms simply because that's the cloud that we're going with over here. So from having adopted Databricks those many years ago and coming to this point today, there's been a lot of advantages from the early adopter space, but also a lot of challenges that you bring along from that time back then. So the first one, the problem with mount points, and a lot of people who do data engineering in Databricks know that you start working with mount points, and what that means is everybody who's accessing data via a cluster is essentially assuming the identity of a service principal to work with the data. So think of it like a bank vault, especially if your data estate is quite large and you've got all kinds of data sets in there, and you've got one service principal with access to a very wide variety of data. And anybody who's got access to a cluster that's running by the service principal automatically gets access to all of that data. So it's a little bit like a bank vault that's left open for people to walk in with assumed identities and do whatever they want with the data. Now, I know that sounds a little dystopian. It's quite not as bad as that, but that's how bad it could get if you don't quite nicely manage that entire state. So unauthorized access is a real problem. There's very limited auditing because most people are working under another identity. You don't quite know who's come in and done what with the data. And as a result of that, there's also data deletion risk because most of these service principals, because they're working across the mount points, they're set up with both read and write access. So there really is nothing stopping from a newbie developer going in and potentially deleting a key data set as well. The other funny challenge that we had was the myth of security. Well, I call it a myth because prior to Unity Catalog, a lot of the organizations, or at least within the teams that we're talking about, the access management was done via file and folder level access in ADLS Gen 2. What that meant was if you are giving an end user access to a folder, which contains, say, a set of files or a tree of files, they have to essentially figure out the semantics of the data from just that file or folder structure and figure out how to query the data rather than just go in and talk about the columns and rows that that data set might contain. What it also means is if there are multiple people from across the markets trying to access one common data set, the concept of fine-grained security is a little bit alien because everybody essentially gets access to almost all of it. The lowest level that you can give access at is at a file level. So if you want to, say, give somebody access to a market, the information for a specific market within that entire file, you're pretty stuffed. And again, we're talking about 8 to 9 petabytes of data with the kind of data estate that we have. So for most analytical requirements that any end user has, the data already probably exists within the data lake. Now the question is, we do have the data, or do we? And if we do, how do we get access to that data? Who owns it? How am I going to understand what the information is within the data set? How does it relate to the other assets that we have? How is a particular column calculated? What downstream or upstream data sources does it arrive based off of? All of that is information that you really cannot get if you're just given access to a file or a folder within a lake and then asked to go and figure it out yourself. So there is all of this lovely data, both internal and external, that sometimes you pay quite a lot of money for as well. But it's very difficult to make sense of it because, one, you don't know where it is. If it does exist, you don't know who owns it and who's managing it, how current it is, and how dependable it is. And if all of that is true, how do you make sense of it in the context of the wider data estate? The other interesting bit, and I think a lot of you will relate to this one, so the default mechanism for sharing data within organizations is still taking copies and sending it to people or putting it in another location. So it's nice when you're starting off. You're taking a copy at a point in time, giving it to whoever requires it. It's brilliant. But when you start scaling it to the kind of scale we're talking about within an enterprise like Unilever, just how many copies of data do you end up with over time? It's something you sometimes don't have an answer to. It's a little bit like how many stars are there in the sky, right? And when you do start maintaining these many copies, securing your data becomes a problem because say you've got a very restricted data set and you've got a copy of that. You've got to secure the copy just as much as you would secure the original data set. You would want to make sure that every single copy, and especially if you're making it current and you're opening it to a wider audience, it is as secure over time, not just at the point in time where you're giving the initial access to. If you are maintaining copies, you need to make sure that it's as current as possible. You need to maintain the pipelines that are creating those copies. You need to ensure that the access mechanism is tied very closely with that process of creating those copies as well. And then you're also putting in all of the extra effort and cost for maintaining those pipelines, the additional compute, the additional storage that comes with creating these copies. And that sounds a little bit trivial, but if you start thinking about all of the different data sets that you're going to share and what the cumulative sizes tend to be, that is quite a lot of money in terms of storage and compute. And finally, ensuring compliance again. So if you've got very restricted or very privileged data sets, and you're creating copies of those and you're putting them in another storage account for somebody to get access to, how are you ensuring compliance? Of course, there's going to be guardrails around it, but at any given point in time, is there one place where you can go and say, these are the different data sets that we've got shared out, and these are the different people who've got access to it, and this is how current the data set is, and this is the point at which somebody's going to stop getting access to it because they don't require it anymore. These are all questions that are very difficult to answer in the traditional ways of working because it's not quite set up for that. And yeah, as I already mentioned, compliance becomes a challenge. So are all of the different copies of my data secure? Is all of the different usage compliant? So let's say it's still secure. Are the users using it for the right kind of requirements? Can I justify the use of any specific data set and say that it's not being fed into an application that shouldn't get access to it? Where is the exposure? If there is a weak point, do I know where that might be? And is all of the data usage tracked? You've got all of this data. Do you know who's using it, how they're using it, and are all of those usages valid? These are all questions you may not necessarily have the right answers to, and that's sort of where Unity Catalog comes in.
So given the context and the challenges, let's see what we did in Unilever, at least in Unilever in Europe. Before we start, as I mentioned, if you're really new to Unity Catalog, there's a few key concepts. So of course, there's a catalog that displays either a table or a volume, and that table or volume sits in an external location. So these are key concepts, relatively new compared to when working with mount points. We'll go into each in a bit. As I mentioned, our data landscape was UDL, BDL, and downstream foundations. Let's look at catalogs first. What did we do catalog-wise? We have a single catalog for UDL, for this area where we land the full fidelity data. Then for BDL, we decided to go for domains. So there's a supply chain catalog, there's a finance catalog, there's a HR catalog, and so on. And finally, the MDL teams that are more downstream, they get their catalog where you can publish things. And that's catalog-wise. Then you have extra storage locations. If you look at the catalog, you need to have _dev, _QA, like the environment, we followed a similar practice for external location. The external location points at a specific container within a storage account, an ADLS Gen 2. We'll go into actually a point of that soon. And tables, well, it's pretty much the same, right? It's an external table just declared on the catalog, but volumes is relatively a new concept, very useful. We use it for two things. One is sort of like a file system. If you have to read from something like a landing area where you land structured, unstructured data before onboarding it into your lake. But the other one we use is actually more for data analysts, so for people that are not so technical, that are just doing like a dashboard on SQL. We give these people their own personal folder where they can just upload whatever little file they need to do to enrich their data. By doing that, we run into our first tip of the day. So when you do volumes, you cannot have them with overlapping scopes. So what happened is we were creating these folders, and then we tried to create a volume covering multiple folders, and we got the error below. So you cannot have volumes overlapping each other. So when you start making volumes on a specific container, make sure you're intentional in how you put it. Then we just went through catalogs, volumes, tables, locations. Then who does what? Catalogs and locations are strategic. It's basically where does our data sit and how do people consume them. That is not something we let anyone in the corporation do. This goes to TDA, which stands for Technical Design Authority. They decide where the data sits and how it's consumed. After the catalog is made, they give it to me, and I then have permission to create tables and volumes on top of it. And you see, of course, across the different environments, dev, QA, prod. In dev, my engineer can go in, make a table, declare it, do the classic hello world. But in QA and prod has to be an MSI, managed service identity, basically a job. We also can create models and functions, but not shares and recipients. So again, strategic, who am I sending my data to? That is also something that goes through TDA, technical design. There's also other types of permissions. So we have things to apply tags, very similar. Writing, well, you see I added user for the volumes, as I mentioned, the self-service. And well, reading, of course, we want people to read the catalog in prod. Now, that's one tip I gave on the volumes. The second tip of the day is on lineage. Of course, when we first did UC, I was so happy and excited, and I did this tactical thing that, of course, no one should do. I said, I'm going to put this thing there, and I'm going to get all the lineage. It's going to be amazing. I typed in something that looks like that code, and what I got was that. It's an isolated box in a lineage graph. Not great. Not what I wanted, right? The way to go, of course, after talking to Athulya, you have to refactor your code. So the code that actually writes the object, you need to read from UC, transform things on the UC-enabled cluster, and write into UC in that job. And then you get this beautiful thing that's honestly really great. You can even click on the columns, and you see the column lineage. The other thing we ran into, tip number 3, well, this is not so much a tip, but as Athulya mentioned, we are early adopters, which means, for example, when we land data, we land into a blob, and then we onboard it into a Gen 2. The blob storage is not, doesn't have something called hierarchical namespace, which means that I cannot create an external location on UC for it. So I actually had to migrate some of my landing areas to Gen 2. So I had to provision a whole new Gen 2 and start landing data there instead of a blob. Then Scala, we have actually a few of our pipelines use helpers. I mean, we're a PySpark team, mainly PySpark and SQL, but sometimes you need Scala for a few helpers, so specifically for surrogate keys. Anything that used Scala last year was breaking. Now, thankfully, the Databricks team fixed that, so you don't have to worry about it. And yeah, those are a bit things we did to set up. And now we go into compatibility. Now, as I mentioned, compatibility has two sides to it. There's people and there's technical. So let's start with the people. As I mentioned, we had different teams inside Europe, and then we consolidated into one. But of course, those teams come with projects that are already live. You need to continue to deliver to the business. And what ended up happening is that I have under my command something like 13 sets of resource groups. And we have a large group of engineers that have to switch between resource groups. And if there's anything in engineering that you want to avoid, is context switching for an engineer. Because you lose a lot of time in like, oh, wait, where am I? What am I doing? That you lose that focus. That's very key for knowledge work. So when you switch from EU1 to EU4, you would maybe have a separate product hierarchy table, or it was called differently. The exchange rate table was different. So when we decided to go for Unity Catalog, we said, no, all of Europe has one catalog. And that really made our team internally consistent. Let's talk about external consistency, because again, I am the Europe team, but I think my colleagues from US are here. There's also, again, the central teams. There are different teams in Unilever. We are a big ecosystem. And I can be an UC-enabled team, but when it's time for me to interact with other teams, maybe they're not there yet. And maybe I depend on them. Maybe they're upstream of me, which is the case. And sometimes they're downstream of me. So when I want to share data, we sometimes talk the different language when I'm like, okay, I'll just give you UC access, and they ask for a mount point. I have a strategy for you. This is tip number 3 or 4. I lost count, sorry. If it's a downstream approach, so if it's a downstream team from me, I literally just say, I'll share data with you when you're on UC. That's it. You just say no, I make a sign, it says no, and then they ask me again, I say no, go on UC. They have to upgrade their Databricks to premium, and then they have to enable UC, and then they get access. But if it's an upstream team, I don't have that power, and it's pretty similar, but you know, I am treated how I treat the downstream teams. They basically say use a mount point. And then I'm a bit screwed if you've ever used a UC-enabled cluster. Because you have the situation where if you use a UC-enabled cluster on non-UC data, it breaks. If you use a non-UC-enabled cluster on UC data, it breaks. And we prepared this nice overview. The skeleton means you get an error message. And actually, for a lot of these, so you see on a lot of the notebooks where you have the situation of reading a Hive metastore combined with UC data, the only thing that will work is actually a single user cluster, which is fine, right? Because you can set up a single user cluster policy, and then when the job runs, it runs as a single user cluster under the MSI. But it's not great. So actually, the recommended thing is that we should aim to use just shared clusters. Some things should break. So you want things to break sometimes, and the ideal setup is where the shared cluster doesn't break. We also have a similar situation for views, right? Because I have something like 100 people every day writing SQL on my environment, and they want to use data from the upstream team, but also my own data. And when they want to make a view and send it to Power BI, it breaks. So if they want to create a view like they're used to, I mean, usually what I tell them is just make a view and then plug that into Power BI. This view will actually give an error because it's mixed. It says you're using Hive and UC. But the code itself will run. So the DB SQL will actually run the code. So what I tell them is just run it on Power BI natively. It's in the meantime, right, while we catch up. Then there's compatibility of regions, because I said, OK, we have something like 13 resource groups. They're not all in the same Azure region. Some of them are in North Europe, and some of them are in West Europe. And that has implication that whatever you do in your North Europe Unity catalog does not reflect on the West Europe Unity catalog. And then you also have to,
yep. It's worth mentioning. So the metastores are different.
Yeah.
So that's the main thing. A metastore in Unity catalog, if you don't know yet, is region dependent. So because there are 2 regions you're working with, you've got one metastore for North Europe and one for West Europe. So that's where the reflecting of the changes across the regions comes in.
And I'll go through what we're doing about that in a bit, but later. But again, going back to this thing with the resource groups and the context switching and making things foolproof in the end, I have a job. It needs to run in environment X. There's 3 things that need to happen. It needs to read from the right catalog. It needs to write into the correct external location. and it needs to declare it into the right catalog. I don't want to run something in QA and then declare it into the prod catalog. So how do we do that? We use cluster policies. So you can set environment variables in the workspace via your cluster policy. So you say, well, actually, this is 445, which is one of my QA environments. Because it's 445, this is the storage location where you will write into. This is your catalog. This is your upstream catalog. And this is your, I forgot what else, well, but some secrets. But then you don't have to worry. And the code looks a bit like this. So again, we're a PySpark team. So this is how a PySpark script would pick up an environment variable from a cluster policy. Finally, we had some tooling. And we started building this because we said that we wanted people to understand the nuances in our data and some of the assumptions that happen when you transform it. And then while we were at it, we said, well, add access in there too. So we made basically some tooling where if you have a YAML file that looks a lot like the one there, you can first say who has access to that object on UC, but also you can see set tags and descriptions, and you can even set them in Markdown on the YAML file. So if you put the Markdown there, when it deploys, when the release happens, you actually see like a nice Markdown description. You might think this might sort of competes with the whole AI description of tables, but you should do this for your most important data sets, because only you know your data better than anyone else. And then that actually will help the data Lakehouse IQ, I'm not sure what they're calling it these days, because then that description helps the AI thing. Okay, as I mentioned, so people can set access. You can do it at schema, table, and volume level. Tags, comments. Looks like this. So you see a nice table, nice descriptions. It even has a link to if your documentation is out, so you can just put a link there. What am I doing next with it? Because of course it's a nice toy I like. We're doing now field masking and AES encryption, which is something we're very fond of now, AES encryption. Now, Athulya can take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. So yeah, that was a really quick overview of how we approached it and what kind of challenges or tips that we picked up along the process. So how does that actually deliver in terms of value for Roberto and the rest of the team? So as Roberto was saying already, there is a unified team now where you had previously multiple teams working in silos, each of them with their own product hierarchies, with their own set of local copies of data. All of that silo has now been broken down because there is a centralized catalog and all of the assets are within the central catalog. There is environment unification as well, so it becomes much easier to manage the whole process and centralize data assets for collaboration. So people from across Europe are all working with the same asset, not copies, not different versions or variations of the asset, the exact same asset. There's much better access management. This goes back to what we were talking about, fine-grained access and managing your access to users via your just ADLS Gen 2 ACLs or whatever. There is a single permission model in place. So Roberto was already talking about external tables and volumes. They are both governed the exact same way. If you did add models functions, they will also be governed the exact same way. And you've got fine-grained access. So if you've got data for all of Europe within a single table, and you want to give someone access to just say UK data or Ireland data or Germany or whatever, you can actually just specify that using row-level security rather than have to give people access to the entire table and hope that they do not query something that they shouldn't see. On top of that, if you did want to segregate how or in what spaces certain data sets are being used, because if you're working with privileged data set, restricted data sets, you tend to have to define in which environment that data set can be used. Just because somebody has access to the data doesn't mean they can access it from anywhere. Workspace bindings comes in for that, so at which point you're not just deciding who is accessing the data, also where from they're accessing the data. So if you need to put additional guardrails in terms of how people are using compute resources within that workspace, that's also possible. So if you take what was there before, lots of files and folders, storage accounts, to tables, objects, records, actual data sets, and access that is tied to how the business works as well. And getting to data quicker. So if you think about how a user would try and understand a folder structure and try and figure out what the data meant and then start querying the data, they don't need to jump through any of those loops right now. They can just go into Unity Catalog, search for whatever they're looking for. Assuming they have access to the data set, they can then discover and explore data centrally. There is a single point for all permissions and management of data. So I don't even want to explain what you may have been doing before, but now it's basically just going into the catalog, into the schema, giving users access. Of course, all of that is managed via AD groups because it's an Azure estate, so you don't really go in and give individual users access. And Unity Catalog centralizes all of that for you as well, so you don't have to manage that again on a workspace basis. It's done at the account level. And what that also means is you're not having to work with resources that are spread across the estate. You get to streamline resources, you get to streamline cost as well. So one of the nice side benefit that Roberto has had is because all of this is now centrally located within Unity Catalog, earlier where there used to be multiple SQL endpoints working with data that was siloed within those workspaces, you can actually put all of those together, take away all of the redundant endpoints, have just one, increase the utilization of that one endpoint, and actually have it used across multiple teams as well. So that's, I think, given you a cost advantages also, right? Then this federation, and I think you can come in here as well. So I think you're probably one of the earlier adopters of federation across quite a lot of our customers. So when that was made available, you've got how many estates now?
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, volume was a bit high. Yeah, so for Lakehouse Federation and Delta sharing, Lakehouse Federation, we set up 8 already because a lot of our partners are actually things like BigQuery or things like Snowflake. And Delta sharing actually was quite interesting because we actually had to jump into the estate of the partner and set up UC for them, and then we got Delta sharing set up. So a lot of times for these newer things, you have to really work together with you're not going to unlock it with an email. Yeah. You need to work together with them. Yep.
And on federation specifically, so if you did not, and what federation is, again, if that's new to you, is essentially being able to dip directly into a source data set to query that via Databricks and have all of your access policies and everything respected as a result of that. So you define your access policies in Databricks, but you are able to go and query whatever sits in the source, whether it be a Synapse warehouse, a SQL Server, or Snowflake, or Redshift, or GBQ. And what that means is where previously you'd have to ask for somebody to land the data, pull the requirements together for them, wait for somebody to build a pipeline to bring that data into a Delta Lake, test the entire pipeline, and then have the pipeline running on a regular basis so you're getting the most recent data. All of that gets scrapped. You just have to say which data set you want access to, and somebody's able to federate that into Databricks, and you're basically done. You avoid a lot of waiting time. You avoid a lot of challenges or issues that you end up with moving data from one place to the other. You also avoid a lot of the extra cost associated with that as well.
And the maintenance of the whole, going back to the copies of data, right? So is the copy of data you send me matching your data? It's a whole discussion.
Yeah. So you now have 8 tables and
8 federation things of different types, but one of them, for example, shares 70 tables with me. So just instantly we got access to 70 objects.
And Roberto already touched on this, Delta sharing. So that was really nice because you had a partner who had data that they could share, but they weren't on UC. So rather than just sit back and go, right, they're not on UC, so we're going to work with SFTP servers instead, Roberto actually influenced them to get on UC and then share their data via Delta sharing. So now there's a 2-way sharing that's available. Again, the process was a little long because they had to be onboarded to UC in the first place. But once that was done, the team basically instantly had access to about 74 of those tables. And the beauty of that is you can just keep adding more and more as you need to. Yeah. And the governance is already in place for that.
So the incremental cost just goes to 0. They can just give you access to an extra view or whatever, and it's done. Yeah.
And a nice result of that is also the fact that there's much closer collaboration. So you are working with them as a proper partner right now, not just a data recipient. And there's now 2-way sharing of data available, very clearly audited access.
When before we were asking like, okay, this thing doesn't match your thing. Can you make sure you haven't restated the data? This was the type of conversations we were having. Now it's more like, ooh, what else do you have? Did you find this trend too? Because there's no discussion. We're both working on the same data set.
The exact same copy, yeah. And visibility into costs. And this is a really interesting one. You probably do quite a lot of cost-based analysis already, but a lot of times, unless you know exactly what is driving up the costs, you tend to be working on some tiny bit somewhere and optimizing quite a lot out of it, but the actual outcome in terms of impact on your costs is not necessarily that high. So what this does, this nice view on the left here, is show you which are the flows that actually impact your cost the most. And then you can basically take an informed decision as to which of these you could optimize and then work on those rather than having to spend time on some obscure piece of code that's not going to go anywhere. And all of that goodness comes from system tables in Unity Catalog, where we basically have all of the information of what kind of jobs you're running, what time is running, which users are accessing data, basically every audited access.
Just 2 questions.
And visibility into usage as well, so tracking by persona, identifying patterns of usage, and again, you can optimize. Finally, future-proofing. UC basically opens up a whole host of features for you. We've just named a lot over there, so Lakehouse IQ is something you already called out before. But please come and talk to us if there's any of this that's specifically interesting, because I think you're basically testing pretty much all of these features as well. I'll hand over to Roberto again to talk about how the collaboration has worked.
Yeah, exactly. Quickly, so we can have some questions, time for questions. But yeah, we set up habits, right? Together with our Databricks account, we have weekly question hours for our business analysts and data analysts. We have quarterly community sessions, basically like a show and tell. And we have sometimes, well, we join the on-site event when there's an AI World Tour or a Data Intelligence Day. I send my team there, and it's fun. It's a fun day out. We meet people. And of course, for the coolest projects, we speak with our solution architect to always make sure we're on the right track. Thanks so much.
Thank
Great
you
questions.
very much. Thank you.